there's one thing better than watching Doctor Who, it's debating about Doctor Who. Is the Sonic overused? Which Doctor is the best? Is Love and Monsters secretly a masterpiece? We all have our hills we'll die on. And the beauty of a long-running show like this is that it can be interpreted in so many different ways. So let's take a look at some of the biggest debates and controversies from across the years. And make sure you let us know where you stand on them as we go. Kicking things off with number 10. Should the Doctor be a killer? For a hero that makes a big deal of being against killing and is very pro-redemption, the Doctor is one bloodthirsty madman sometimes. We're not talking about the justifiable act to end the Time War here, we're talking about the slightly more callous acts of murder, sending the Sycorax leader falling to his death, gleefully blasting Solomon with heat-seeking missiles, suffocating space cooks. These are just a few instances where the man who never would absolutely did. Russell T Davies recently weighed in on this debate in a chat with Entertainment Weekly, and he said, quote, "I thought that right now in 2024 we need a hero with more heart. I'm not a fan of the ones that slice and dice. Doctor Who is the opposite of heroes who pick up a gun and shoot, or a lightsaber and kill. It's a marvellously pacifist show." A nice sentiment, but rich words coming from the man who had the new Doctor literally impale the Goblin King with a church steeple in his first episode, just like all pacifists do. Sometimes there's no other way can be a compelling story beat, forcing our protagonist into a position where they grapple with the fact that they simply have no option but to take a life. Deep Breath and 12's apparent murder of the half-faced man is a good example of this. 10 drowning the Rachnos is another good one, if you can handle listening to the Empress screaming again, that is. But for every instance of this working well, there's another episode where murdering the villain is written in as a lazy get-out-of-jail-free card, and the Doctor skips off into the sunset without a care in the world. Number 9. Did Amy and Rory stay too long? Moffat-era companions had a habit of sticking around. Amy, Rory and Clara were there for more time than any revival companion until Yaz came along. There's a case for arguing all 4 of these characters stuck around just a little too long, but the cracks really started to show with Amy and Rory. Their story was pretty much concluded at the end of Series 6, with River's timeline cleared up, Amy unequivocally committed to Rory, and the two even getting a perfect happy ending at the end of the God Complex. The Doctor drops them off because he's become too attached and wants to keep them safe, which is the sort of companion ending that isn't explored enough. But then we got Series 7A, which wasn't great. Asylum of the Daleks clearly has no idea how to move forward with the Ponds, and instead decides to move backwards by having them file for a divorce off-screen. Amy's treatment of Rory in this episode completely unravels the journey she spent the last 2 years on, learning to see him as her real hero. The next episode spend time treading familiar ground, with the Ponds drifting more toward their personal lives. And there's a lingering feeling that this is little more than a way to stretch out their story for 5 more episodes. On the plus side, there are some really nice moments in The Power of Three, and The Angels Take Manhattan is a banger, but we're not sure if it was worth it. Number 8. Where does canon begin and end? Some franchises keep a pretty tight hold on what is and isn't canon, but Doctor Who takes the other approach by not having it fully defined. The expanded universe is a big old place with a long and storied history, especially during the Wilderness years. Big Finish is pumping out audio content like it's going out of fashion, and you have other companies like Titan Comics also dropping regular releases, not to mention all the video games and novels too. Point is, there's far too much Doctor Who content out there to possibly even attempt to consolidate it into a timeline that makes sense. So why bother? The audience can decide what is and isn't canon, and the only thing that does stick is the main TV show, plus its spin-offs. With more and more expanded universe content appearing in the show, like Beep the Meep hopping from the comics to the screen, and the 8th Doctor canonizing Charlie and his other companions in his regeneration scene, the lines are only getting blurrier anyway. Number 7. Is Danny Pink a good character? Series 8 has a mixed reputation, which partly stems from the original knee-jerk reaction to an older Doctor than we were used to for the revival. It's a series that has aged very well though, with some terrific stories like Listen and Mummy on the Orient Express. One thing fans still can't seem to agree on though is Danny Pink. Introduced as a love interest for Clara and a foil for the Doctor, Danny wasn't nearly as well received as Rory or even Mickey, despite filling the same role. This may be because he doesn't fully reconcile his differences alliances with the Doctor and join the TARDIS crew like his predecessors. His relationship with the Doctor is more openly hostile too, though to give credit to the man, his first impression of the Doctor isn't 9 with his goofiness or 11 with his manic pixie energy. It's Series 8-12 who's a bit of a tough cookie. Without the context of prior incarnations, you might not get on with him either. Danny provides Clara with a much-needed anchor to reality, helping to develop her as an actual character, a marked improvement on the blank mystery box she is in Series 7B. Many argue that Danny is boring, while others argue he's just a normal, straightforward bloke, and that makes him likeable and relatable. His backstory, accidentally shooting a child dead in the middle of a war zone, treads surprisingly mature ground for the show too. It's later tackled in a very nuanced way in Death in Heaven, but for many that wasn't enough to rescue the character. Number 6. Does the series numbering actually matter? And now we come to one of the latest debates within the fandom. It was announced last year that Ncuti Gatwa's first series would not in fact be named Series 14. Instead, we were meant to refer to it as Season 1, with the numbering resetting akin to how it did when the show relaunched in 2005. The issue most people took with this is that, unlike the 2005 relaunch, the show hasn't been off the air for 16 years, nor were we likely to see any significant status quo changes like we did between McCoy and Eccleston. There's also the frustrating issue that the show already has a Season 1, the very first season back in 1963. To play devil's advocate though, Doctor Who is now hitting a huge international audience that may not be familiar with the show, and Series 14 is a daunting jumping on point. And it's possible this wasn't even a Russell T Davies decision. It might have been enforced by Disney as part of the new streaming deal. But what's most important is that we have more Doctor Who. Number 5. Did Moffat ruin the Weeping Angels? First introduced in Blink, that one Doctor Who episode that even your cool friends have seen, these terrifying stone assassins made such an impact that it's no surprise that Stephen Moffat brought them back pronto once he had the big boy chair. Unfortunately, that's where, according to some, it started to fall apart. Any image of an angel could now become an angel. Okay, fair enough. An interesting addition that was utilised quite well, but more rules kept coming. The angels didn't attack if they thought they were observed, even if they weren't, and on top of this, they now don't always send you back in time. They can also snap your neck, rip out your vocal cords, and use them to reanimate your disembodied voice. Very metal, but ultimately far less interesting. And there are contradictions too. The Time of Angels 2 Heads twist hinges on the fact that the angels have a fixed form, but in The Angels Take Manhattan, we see baby cherub angels and a Statue of Liberty angel, the latter of which somehow manages to cross a city without being observed. Also, not made of stone. But Moffat also broke the biggest rule of all. He let us see the angels move. The angels have always been a fourth wall breaking villain in that if the audience observes them, they are also frozen. So quite what the thinking behind this movement scene was, we haven't a clue. Number 4. Who is the Doctor's arch nemesis? For a pacifist, the Doctor has a startling amount of nemesis. There are a number of contenders for the title of arch-nemesis, from the Master to Davros and the Daleks and the Cybermen. Although if we're being honest, the Cybermen might think they're in the running, but they aren't. Let's take a look at the Master first. This character is textbook arch-nemesis material, playing into the oldest bad guy trope in the book, the same as the protagonist, but evil. They're relatively evenly matched in terms of intellect, have a rich shared history but opposing worldviews, and more than anything, they both want to be on the same side. This is villain coding 101, but that isn't to say it's not one of the most compelling dynamics of the show. Next up, you have the Daleks, led by Davros. With far more appearances under their belt, their presence is certainly felt more than the Masters, both in the show and across popular culture. During the first Russell T Davies era, they're also clearly positioned as the big bad of the show, and although they're not great at exterminating the Doctor, they are very good at taking away the things he cares about. Their plans also tend to be more universe-threatening than the Master's kooky schemes, which often just serve to provoke the Doctor. To be honest, there's a compelling case for both, although the Master's personal connection to the Doctor probably does make them fit the mold just a little bit better. Number 3. Does the show lose its charm with a good budget? Doctor Who has always had ambitions slightly beyond its own reach. While the show was fairly contemporary when it first aired, the effects began to fall behind the scope of the scripts. This became an even bigger problem when the BBC cut off the show's air supply and pushed it out the airlock on a shoestring budget to die. Around the time that Star Wars was reinventing sci-fi, Doctor Who was so dated that the hokey effects became a part of its identity. There was obviously a huge leap in production quality when Series 1 launched in 2005, but that silly charm remained intact, with creatures like the Slitheen and the Absorbaloff putting aside any doubt that the show had outgrown its roots. It wasn't until the Moffat era that the effects seemed to, for the most part, catch up to the current standard, with the Chibnall era sometimes going too far in the other direction with an over-reliance on CGI, despite marked improvements overall. It was during this era that the show lost some of its visual identity, and this is a question that's come back into circulation recently, with Disney bankrolling the show into what we can only assume is by far its highest budget ever. And so far, it's hard to argue with the results. Everything looks high quality, but there's a camp charm to the space babies and murderous music and an evil ambulance that still feels like Doctor Who. Number 2, is bi-generation a good idea? Last year, we were given something a little different when the time came to pass the baton to the 15th Doctor. Instead of the usual fireworks, 14 gets shot by a laser cannon, pulls Ncuti Gatwa out of his ribcage, and walks the whole thing off. It sounded bad in concept when it leaked, but the episode managed to pull it off, using this bi-generation to rehabilitate the Doctor and shake off the trauma they'd spent 60 years piling on. The Doctor could retire without affecting the timeline of the show, and it all worked rather neatly. There are, however, a number of issues people have with this. Firstly, including the Meta-Crisis Doctor, we now canonically have 3 Doctors walking around the universe played by David Tennant, which feels bizarre. Russell T Davies's suggestion that every regeneration is now retroactively a bi-generation is also far too messy to unpack, and is something that could undercut the show's history severely if it were explored. Speaking of undercutting, there's discussion around whether forcing Gatwa to share his first scenes with Tennant and having another Doctor on Earth for potentially his whole era is fair on him or not. The show does seem to be pushing forward though, which is important to establish that this new Doctor is the definite article. Number 1, who's the better modern showrunner? Stephen Moffat's return with Boom has reignited the old RTD versus Moffat debate. It's a debate that's raged for years, and there's a compelling case for both. In one corner, Russell T Davies, 2-time title holder and the big brain behind getting Doctor Who back on our screens. His strengths? Bringing a grounded modern take to the show, and somehow making a pop culture punchline into something that appealed to noughties kids without totally alienating classic fans. He excels at world building and carefully setting the stage for explosive finales, and because of this, his era spawned the only 2 spin-offs in the show's history that didn't crash and burn. His companions felt like real people more than any other writer, and his crowning achievement is creating a Doctor that rivals Tom Baker's mainstream popularity in David Tennant. But the man has his shortcomings too. He's penned some fairly weak scripts considering his enormous talent, like Love and Monsters, New Earth, and recently Space Babies. He's also prone to some lazy story resolutions. I mean, who could forget the Jesus Doctor, or all the convenient buttons that annihilated the New Dalek Empire? Then you have Stephen Moffat. Under the Moff's reign, the show finally broke America, garnering international appeal during the Matt Smith era. Most people would agree that he also turned in more 10 out of 10 scripts than any other modern writer, with barnstormers like Blink, The 11th Hour, and Heaven Sent, to name just a few. Under Russell T Davies, Moffat's episodes were consistently among the fan favourites, and it's no wonder he was given the showrunner job. That said, he's often accused of convoluted, messy series arcs that didn't seem to have an end in sight, and his companions tended to be a little more Marmite with audiences. The show also entered its first modern slump during Series 7, and you could argue it never truly recovered. Ultimately, it comes down to whose writing style and showrunning style you prefer. Don't forget to let us know your stance on these debates in the comments down below, and for more controversial moments, why not check out 10 Doctor Who moments that made you say WTF were they thinking? In the meantime, I've been Ellie for Who Culture, and in the words of Riversong herself, goodbye, sweeties.